How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Mem Aleph, Daf 41 of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, on Daf Mem Aleph, there's basically two main sections that I've identified. In the first section, we wrap up the discussion that we've been having between Par Kohen Mashiach, Par Davar Shel Tzibur, Seirei avodah zarah, that kind of Par Yom Kippurim, and all the kind of weaving in between those different korbanos, Seirei Yom Kippurim. Basically, the different chatos apnimios. So the first section will discuss Seirei avodah zarah and how that relates to Par Davar Shel Tzibur. The second section of today's daf will discuss the sugya of mefaglim bechatze avodah, half pigul. Can you have sort of partial pigul, right? Of course, with the chatos apnimios, there are, right, let's just say there's 4 matanos hadam. So what if you did 2 of them with machshavas chutz lizmano and the other ones without? Can that be pigul? How do we view that? Anyways, that is going to be the second section of today's daf, which is really going to continue into tomorrow's daf, but we will nonetheless get started with it today. Friends, that is what we have on the agenda for daf Mem Aleph of Masechta Zevachim. Join me. Here we go. All right, friends, we are going to begin on daf Mem Aleph, Amid Aleph, about 6 or 7 lines into the Amid. Lapar zepar helem dover shel tzibur, but tzibur gufei ksiv da. Friends, we had seen yesterday the shita of Rabbi Yishmael. We had seen yesterday machlokes. Okay, if we even back up a shtickle further, we saw the opinion of Rav Papa who had said that when the pasuk says lapar, it's coming to include par Yom Kippurim for es badam utvila, and then we saw machlokes between Rebbe and Rabbi Yishmael. Rebbe, there's different cases of Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva, let's say, had agreed with Rav Papa, how Rav Papa was learning things, that lapar is coming to include par Yom Kippurim for all of its halachos, including es badam utvila. Now, Rabbi Yishmael disagreed. He said that could be learned out from a kal v'chomer. So what do we learn out from lapar? So interestingly, this is still from yesterday's daf. So Rabbi Yishmael had said lapar zepar helen dover shel tzibur. That lapar is helen dover shel tzibur. Lifar zepar kohen Mashiach. Meaning, by par helen dover shel tzibur, the pasuk says, also lapar, kasher also lifar, hachatas kenyaiselo v'chipar aleim hakoyin v'nisach loim. So it says lapar and lifar. So according to Rabbi Yishmael, lapar is a reference to par davar shel tzibur. Now what's peculiar about that is that the pasuk is written in the context of par davar shel tzibur. Kilu, why would you need a pasuk by par davar shel tzibur to say that it's talking about itself? Obviously, it's talking about itself. That's the Gemara's question. So again, Rabbi Yishmael had said that lapar is a reference to par davar shel tzibur, which is itself, and lifar is a reference to par kohen Mashiach, right? So also lapar, kasha also lifar, kilu, to the par, just like, right, the halachos of par kohen Mashiach apply to par davar shel tzibur. But again, the peculiar thing here is that lapar is a reference to par davar shel tzibur, but we're already talking about par davar shel tzibur, so it's just referencing itself. So, fact the Gemara, lapar is a par davar shel tzibur. If Rabbi Yishmael had said that, right, meaning since Rabbi Yishmael had said that lapar, which is written in the context, in the parsha of par davar shel tzibur, and we're saying lapar is a reference to par davar shel tzibur, habit tzibur gufei ksiv, but this pasuk itself is written in the context, in the parsha of par davar shel tzibur. Why does it have to reference itself? Amar a puppet, it says a papa mishum, because the boy agmure par elem dover shel tzibur bioseres v'shtei kleus lit Siri avodas kuchovim ufarim davar shel tzibur begufei loksiv be'akesha osi itzich lefar itzich lapar lemeve kiman dichsiv be begufei v'lo le'avodah v'lo be'akesh chozom lam be'akesh. Chavi, you got it? Should we go weiter? Very, very interesting stuff. Basically, so as I kind of had said in the introduction, that we're like weaving between Par Kohen Mashiach, Par Davar Shel Tzibur, Sirei avodah zarah, Par Yom HaKippurim, even Seir Yom HaKippurim. Everything is just kind of weaving in between. Everything's connected one way or another. Lapar, Lifar, Chatas, all sorts of ways. Everything's kind of intermingled over here. So, if you look at the psukim in Sefer Vayikra, in the 4th chapter of Sefer Vayikra in the Torah, so by Par Kohen Mashiach, it explicitly writes about the Yoseres HaKaved, the diaphragm, and the Shtei HaKlayos, the two kidneys. However, that is not written, and we're going to see an interesting drash on why it is not written on Daf Mem Aleph Mid Beis, but it is not written by Par Davar Shel Tzibur. So then how do we know the Yoseres HaKaved v'Shtei HaKlayos by Par Davar Shel Tzibur? Well, it says, so that's where this comes in handy. To say, right, Lapar, when it says Lapar is Par Davar Shel Tzibur, it's to include the chiyuv of the emurim to burn the Yoseres HaKaved v'Shtei HaKlayos, to make it as though it's written by the Par Davar Shel Tzibur. Why is that necessary? Well, because meaning if we're saying Lapar is Par Davar Shel Tzibur and Lifar is Par Kohen Mashiach, meaning we already know that there is a connection between Par Kohen Mashiach and Par Davar Shel Tzibur. So why is that not enough to say that just like by Par Kohen Mashiach there's the Yoseres HaKaved and the Shtei HaKlayos, so also by the Par Davar Shel Tzibur there's the Yoseres HaKaved and Shtei HaKlayos. Why do we need this extra Lapar to say Par Davar Shel Tzibur? So here's the thing. By a Sa'ir avodah zarah, right? When Bezdin we learned about this from Masechta Horius, Bezdin accidentally rules regarding avodah zarah that something is permitted when really it's not. So everyone goes and Be'etzem worships avodah zarah. They realize, oh no, we made a big mistake. So they bring a par la'ola and a sa'ir l'chatas. So for this sa'ir hachat, right, for this chatas, so we learn that by the sa'ir avodah zarah, there is also a requirement to burn the Yoseres HaKaved in the Shtei HaKlayos. How do we know that? Well, that's learnt out from Par Davar Shel Tzibur. Right? We had said the other day already on Daf Lamed Testament Beis that when it says Hachatos, flipping back to, it says Hachatos Elu Seir Avodas Kuchavim. Just to confirm, yeah, that's written by Par Davar Shel Tzibur. So we have the connection through the word hachatas between Par Davar Shel Tzibur and Sirei avodah zarah, and we'll say that just like by Par Davar Shel Tzibur, there's the chiyuv of the Yoseres HaKaved and the Shtei HaKlayos. So also by the Sirei avodah zarah, there is the requirement of the Yoseres HaKaved and the Shtei HaKlayos. Simple enough, but here's the wrench. Here's the thing. It doesn't actually say by Par Davar Shel Tzibur, Yoseres HaKaved and Shtei HaKlayos. That's actually learned out from Par Kohen Mashiach. So now here's the thing. Now all of a sudden, Sari Yom HaKippurim is feeling Sari avodah zarah is feeling very distant. Meaning it doesn't say Yoseres HaKaved and Shtei HaKlayos by Par Davar Shel Tzibur, nor does it say by Siri avodah zarah. It does say it by Par Kohen Mashiach. So now there's a connection between Par Kohen Mashiach and Par Davar Shel Tzibur. Okay, so by Par Davar Shel Tzibur there'll also be Yoseres HaKaved and Shtei HaKlayos. And then there's a connection between Par Davar Shel Tzibur and Siri avodah zarah. So we'll say, okay, fine. So Yoseres HaKaved and Shtei HaKlayos also now applies to Siri avodah zarah. The thing is, the question is, something that's learnt out through a hekish, something that's learnt out kind of pulled into Par Davar Shel Tzibur because it says Lifar being Par Kohen Mashiach, so therefore we learn by Par Davar Shel Tzibur that Yoser Sakav and Shtei HaKlayos applies there. Can we now, when we're only learning Yoser Sakav and Shtei HaKlayos to begin with for Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur from Par Kohen Mashiach, is that kind of strong enough to now be able to learn out Sa'ir Avodah Zarah, that it also has a chiyuv of Yoser Sakav and Shtei HaKlayos from Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur, which itself, it actually isn't written by, it's only learned from Par Kohen Mashiach. And that is why Lapar, that's why Rabbi Shmuel says that actually by Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur, when it says Lapar, it's going to include itself. Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur. It's coming to include for itself the chiyuv that by Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur, there is the Oseres HaKavod, so that it's not just being learnt out from Par Kohen Mashiach, it's as though it is actually written by the Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur. It's as though, right, Lapar by Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur is coming to include Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur. What about Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur? The chiyuv of Yoseres HaKavod and Shtei HaKlayos, to make it as though it's actually written by the Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur, so that now, if it's actually written for all intents and purposes, well, then it can be learned, applied to the Sa'ir Avodah Zarah, to say that also by the Sa'ir Avodah Zarah, there's a chiyuv of Yoser Sakav and Shtei HaKlayos. It's no longer that the Sa'ir Avodah Zarah is being learned from the Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur, which itself is only being learned from the Par Kohen Mashiach. No, it's as if the Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur now itself becomes a primary source. It's as though it's written itself by Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur, the chiyuv of Yoser Sakav and Shtei HaKlayos, so that now it could be a primary source to teach Seir Avodah Zarah. Wow. All of these different things, you have to keep on remembering what's what and how they intermingle. With Kachim, there's a lot of moving pieces, right? Because there's a lot of different kinds of korbanos. So again, Lapar is a Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur. So Rabbi Shmuel had said that when it says Lapar, that's a reference to Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur. Babble Tzibur Gufei Ksiv. But one second, why do I need Lapar? Right, I'm reading this again. Right, why do I need Lapar to reference Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur if we're already talking about Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur? Why does it need to reference itself? Papa says a Papa Mishum, because the boy Agmurid Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur Bioseres V'Shtei HaKlayos L'Sir Avodas Kucham, because Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur is going to be the source for Yoser Sakav and Shtei HaKlayos for Sir Avodah Zarah. Right, but Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur, it says Achatos, which is a reference to Sir Avodah Zarah. So the connection is made between Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur and Sir Avodah Zarah. And so Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur is going to be the source for the Emurim of Yoser Sakav and Shtei HaKlayos for Sir Avodah Zarah. The thing is, it actually doesn't say by Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur that you have to burn the Yoser Sakav and Shtei HaKlayos. It's learned from the connection with Par Kohen Mashiach. By Par Kohen Mashiach, it says Yoser Sakav and Shtei HaKlayos. And because we have a connection, I assume that connection is from Lifar, referring to Par Kohen Mashiach. So we have a connection between Par Kohen Mashiach and, right, was it also Lapar Kasher also Lifar, right? You'll do to the Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur like you did to the Par Kohen Mashiach. So there's that connection there. And since by the Par Kohen Mashiach there's Yoser Sakav and Shtei HaKlayos, so also by the Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur there's Yoser Sakav and Shtei HaKlayos. So it's durch Lifar. So it's durch Lapar. So we needed Lapar to include Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur, to include itself, Limeheve, to make it as though Kiman dichsiv begufe, as though it were actually written Yoser Sakav V'Shtei HaKlayos by Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur, making Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur a primary source, and from there it could be taught to Sir Avodah Zarah v'lo lahave davar lamed behekesh chozor lamed behekesh, so that we can avoid the situation of davar lamed behekesh chozor lamed behekesh, that's something which is itself only learned from a juxtaposition, right? Meaning Par Lamdav Shel Tzibur itself, we're only learning out Yoser Sakav and Shtei HaKlayos from the fact that it says in the pasuk lifar to learn from Par Kohen Mashiach, you then can't learn out Sa'ir avodah zarah because it says hachatos by Parlam Davar Shatzibur. So you can't all these words, which if Sa'ir avodah if Parlam Davar Shatzibur is only itself being learned out from Par Kohen Mashiach, you wouldn't be able to then learn out Sa'ir avodah zarah from Parlam Davar Shatzibur. That's why it says lapar to include itself, to make it a primary source to be able to teach Sa'ir avodah zarah. Because there is, as Rashi points out at the end of like the big Rashi at the beginning of the wide lines, it says at the end of the Ein Lamedim B'Kodshim Lamed Bakish Min Lamed Bakish. That's specific. We have seen this before, that there's a specific halacha when it comes to Kodshim, and of course we're learning Kodshim now, if you haven't noticed. So by Kodshim, you can't learn out via a hekesh from something that it itself was already learned via hekesh. So again, Lapar basically is there to convert Parlam Davar Shel into a primary source, so that then it can teach Yosef Sakav and Shtei Klayos to Seir Avodah Zarah. Givaldig. Tani Kavasadar Papa. Givaldig. And we have a brisa in support of Rav Papa. Also, Kasher, also Matam Lom Lapar. How come in the pasuk by Parlam Davar Shel it has to say Lapar? Lefisha Nemar Vehem Heviu es Korbanom Ishe La Hashem, and continues that pasuk V'chatosom La Hashem Al Shigigosom, that this is the pasuk by Seir Avodah Zarah. By Seir Avodah Zarah it says, I'm reading it again, Vehem Heviu es Korbanom Ishe La Hashem, and they brought their korban. Actually, let me actually read the whole pasuk. The pasuk says by Seir Avodah Zarah, I'm reading the pasuk, V'chipra HaKohen al kol adas b'nei Yisrael v'nislach lohem. Okay, that the Kohen will offer the korban for them, and they'll get atonement. But now the pasuk, I'm still reading the pasuk. The pasuk now goes on to adds this whole kind of section to the pasuk that seems extra. Kishgagu ve'meviu es korbana mishel Hashem v'chatosom lefnei Hashem al shigagosom, and they brought their korban. Like, why are we teaching all this stuff? So we learn out from that, Chatosom, Elu, Siri Avodas Kochavim. Okay, when it says Chatosom, that's a reference to the Siri Avodah Zarah. Shigigosom, Ze Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur. And when it says, it says, Ve'viu Korbanim Mishel Hashem V'chatosom L'fnei Hashem Al Shigigosom. So the Shgaga is the Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur. So when it says Chatosom, that's a reference to the Siri Avodah Zarah. And when it says Shigigosom, it's a reference to Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur. Chatosom kishigigosom. And the Seir Avodah Zarah is like the Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur. Shigigosom meichon lamadata lo behekish. So 1 second, if we're going to say that Chatosom is like Shigigosom, to say that by Seir Avodah Zarah there's going to be Yoser Sakav and Shtei Klayos just like by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur, but Shigigosom meichol lamadata lo behekish. But wasn't the chiyuv of Yoser Sakav and Shtei Klayos by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur only itself learnt out from the connection to Sa'ir to Par Kohen Mashiach? What can something which it itself was only learnt out through a hekish, right? The chiyuv of Yoser Sakav and Shtei Klayos by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur, which itself was only learnt out from Par Kohen Mashiach, can it now teach to Seir Avodah Zarah? So Talmud Omar lapar. So that is why by Parlam Davar it says lapar. Ze Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur lapar lifar ze Par Kohen Mashiach. That's why by Parlam Davar it says lapar, which is a reference to itself, and lifar is a reference to Par Kohen Mashiach, in order to bring over the Yoser Sakav and Shtei Klayos from Par Kohen Mashiach to Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur, to make it as though it's actually written by Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur, to make Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur a primary source to then be able to teach to Seir Avodah Zarah. So we see that there is a brisa in support of Rav Papa's proposition that lapar, being a reference to itself, to Parlam Davar Shel Tzibur, is to make Parim Davar Shel Tzibur a primary source for Yoseres HaKov and Shtei HaKlayos. Omar Mar, we had said earlier, Chatosam Elu Sir Avodas Kuchavim. So, by the pasuk by Sir Avodah Zarah, we have said that Chatosam is a reference to Sir Avodah Zarah, and Shigasim is a reference to Parim Davar Shel Tzibur. We made the connection there between Parim Davar Shel Tzibur and Sir Avodah Zarah. But typically, Mikra Kama, Damar Hachatas Abba Sir Avodas Kuchavim. Friends, as I mentioned earlier, already on Daf Lamed Tes, Amud Beis, we mentioned that when the pasuk says by Parim Davar Shel Tzibur, Hachatas, it says Va'asol Apar Kasher Also Lapar Hachatas. We said that Hachatas is a reference to Sir Avodah Zarah. So we already know from Parim Davar Shel Tzibur the connection between Parim Davar Shel Tzibur and Sir Avodah Zarah. Why by Sir Avodah Zarah do we have Chatas as a reference to Sir Avodah Zarah and Shigasim as a reference to Parim Davar Shel Tzibur, and there's the connection? Why do I need that connection? I already have it from Parim Davar Shel Tzibur. We need the connection also by Sir Avodah Zarah because I may have thought look, I may have thought that when the pasuk says by Parim Davar Shel Tzibur Hachatos, and that makes the connection between Parim Davar Shel Tzibur and Sir Avodah Zarah, maybe that's only for the Matan Damim, to say that the Sir Avodah Zarah, the Matan Damim is on the Mizbeach HaKetoris in the Heichel, just like by Parim Davar Shel Tzibur. Aval Yoseres v'Shtei HaKlayos the lo ksivan begufei emalo, but the Yoseres HaKaved and the Shtei HaKlayos, which isn't written explicitly by Parim Davar Shel Tzibur, maybe that wouldn't carry over to Sir Avodah Zarah. So Kamashman, that's why I have Chatos and Shkaga to make that connection also by Sir Avodah Zarah, to say that it is not, that the connection between Sir Avodah Zarah and Parim Davar Shel Tzibur is not limited to the Azos, but also extends to the Emurin of Yoseres HaKavod and Shtei HaKlayos. And now we hop back to the Yom HaKippurim for a second. So Rav Papa had said, I think already in yesterday's daf, that all these dafs kind of merge into each other, that when it says la par, so according to the view that la par is talking about Par Yom HaKippurim, we just, of course, were exploring the view of Rabbi Shmuel that says that la par is Parim Davar Shel Tzibur and lifar is Par Kohen Mashiach. But according to the view that la par is Par Yom HaKippurim, so Rav Papa had said that it teaches es badam utvila. Es badam utvila, that is what we learn from la par. However, there's another shita that la par actually teaches everything, meaning Rav Papa had said that, the Matan Damim is learned out from Chuka, which is Ma'akev, and right, there was also Kiper and Kila Kiper, and Lo Kiper, right, that whole thing. But there's another sheet that says that everything is learned out from La Par. So says the Gemara, Amalei, Rafuna B'Rav Rav Nosson, says Rafuna B'Rav Rav Nosson, the Rav Pape, Ve'atano Par Yom HaKippurim Lichol Masham Rabbeinu. What is, does the Aleph add La Par? No, the Rabba is Par Yom HaKippurim Lichol Masham Rabbeinu. There's a shita, there's a bryce that says that La Par Taka teaches everything, not just Es Badam Utvila. So says Rav Papa Tanai, it's Taka Machlokas Tanim Tana Devei Rav, that was taught in the Besmench of Rav. So Rashi Taka says something interesting, which is Tana Devei Rav is Toras Kohanim, which is the Medrash Halacha on Sefer Vayikra, and it says Rashi called Toras Kohanim Kori Tana Devei Rav. Interesting that Toras Kohanim is called Tana Devei Rav. Interesting. So it says in Tana Devei Rav. So Tana Devei Rav Marbe Ochi. So Tana Devei Rav learns like Rav Papa learned that La Par is only Es Badam Utvila. Tana Devei Rabbi Shmuel Lo Marbe Ochi. Whereas Tana Devei Rabbi Shmuel doesn't learn it like Rav Papa, rather he would say that everything is learned out from La Par, which is interesting because Rabbi Shmuel himself had said that lapar is for Palam Davar Shel Tzibur, but I guess that there was a different, right? I mean, Rashi points out Tanat Devar Bishmal is like kind of like a collection of brises and stuff, and I guess there in that collection they brought down from lapar that it would include everything, not just es badam utvila, but also the matan damim and things like that. Tanat Devar Bishmal is taught by the Besmedrash of Bishmal mepnema nemru yoseres v'shtei klayos bepar koin Mashiach v'lo nemru bepar Davar Shel Tzibur. So they taught the Besmedrash of Yishmael, though interestingly, so Rashi says over here, kind of like directly to the left. It says it's in the middle of the. Let me see. Yeah, it's in the middle of this kind of on the second line of this Rashi. It says Devar Yishmael he shenishnes v'nizdera bebeis midrash shel Yishmael. That it was taught the Besmedrash of Rabbi Shmuel, v'sidru ba divrei tanoim harbe kimo shesidru Rabbi Chiya v'Rabbi Shaya. So interesting. So of course there were different collections of brises and toseftas. Well, toseftas are kind of brises, right? Of course, Rebbe edited the Mishnayos, but then there was also the tosefta, which was edited by Rabbi Chiya and Rabbi Shaya. And apparently, Tanat Rabbi Shmuel is a similar kind of thing. That in the Besmedrash of Rabbi Shmuel, they taught all sorts of different brises, and those were collected into their own sort of collection of brises, just like by Rabbi Chiya and Rabbi Shaya. Very interesting. So anyways, so it's taught in the Besmedrash of Rabbi Shmuel. How come, as we've been discussing, that by Parkoin Mashiach, it says Yoser Shtei Kleos, but by Par Davar Shel Tzibur it doesn't. And we've just been saying, okay, fine, no big deal. And we learn out one from the other. We even apply it to Sir avodah zarah. But how come? After all, I mean, all the other, right, a lot of other stuff is kind of overlapped between the two. How come Yoseres Akavit and Shtei Kleos is left out from Param Davar Shel Tzibur, but it's in Parkoy Mashiach? Well, it's a parable to a king who got very upset with somebody who he loves. In this case, they're talking about the Rabbanu Shalom and Am Yisrael. Umiyat b'sirchono mipnei chibaso. And so the king got very upset at somebody who he loves. And yes, he was very upset, but he also kind of cut back a little bit on the anger a little bit because he loves this friend so much. So yes, he was very angry, but the level of his anger was not fully, what's the word I'm thinking of? Reflected in the amount of anger that he showed. That he showed less anger than really he felt because out of the love for this friend. So here we're talking about Palam Davar Shel Tzibur, the entire Am Yisrael sinned. And this is kind of what happens when they sin. They bring a Palam Davar Shel Tzibur. So the Rabbanu Shalom kind of cut back on the instructions by Palam Davar Shel Tzibur so as not to kind of like pile on by this Korban Chatas when Am Yisrael sinned. So we learn it out instead from Parkoy Mashiach. V'tanat Rabbi Shmuel, stop at this mention of Shmuel. B'nei nemra parochas hakodesh v'Parkoy Mashiach v'lo nemar v'Palam Davar Shel Tzibur. How come by Parkoy Mashiach the pasuk says that it'll sprinkle the blood by the parochas hakodesh, the holy parochas, the parochas of the kodesh? But it just says the parochas by Par El Davar Shel Tzibur. It doesn't say the parochas of the kodesh. Mashal Melech Bas Adam. It's a parable to a king Shesarch Olav Medina, that his people rebelled against him. Immi Uta Sarcha. So if not so many people rebelled, it's kind of manageable. Okay, Beseder. So it's business as usual. Pamal Yishalom is Kayemes. He operates business as usual. He's still connecting in with his inner cabinet and all things like that. However, in Ruba Sarcha, but if there's a major upheaval, major protests, and everyone's rebelling against the king, well then, the assumption is not that like the king is going to be overthrown. The king is the king, he's all powerful. But when he sees that all of his people are rebelling against him, he kind of goes inward, goes a bit internal. What's it, what's what I'm thinking of? I don't know. But he kind of becomes a little more reserved from his people, from his cabinet and things like that. So in Ruba Sarcha, Ein Pamayah Shalom is Kayemes, it's not business as usual, and he's kind of keeps a little distance from his people, wow, no words are coming to my head right now, from his like guards and ministers and things like that. So what were we even talking about anymore? So why does it say Parochas HaKodesh by Parker Mashiach and not by Palam Davar Tzibur? Because since Palam Davar Tzibur is a scenario where most of Am Yisrael is sinned, as we learned about Masechta Horius already, so therefore it doesn't say Parochas HaKodesh because God becomes a bit more reserved and backed off a little bit. That's why it doesn't say Parochas HaKodesh. All right, friends, and now we move on to the next section of today's daf, half pigul, mefaglin bechatzi matir. This is going to be an interesting sugya. I think the best thing is probably just to jump in, probably. But let me actually just say one thing before we jump in. So remember, we are talking about the chatos apnimios. We're talking about these inner chatases, right? When it comes to chatas achitzonis, right, we had said that even one of the matanos is sufficient, right? So by chatos achitzonios, so the kohen would apply the blood to all four of the karnos hamizbeach. However, if you only applied it to one, that is sufficient. And we said that because of that, if you only add machshavas pigul by the first matana, it would already be pigul. Now, by the chatos apnimios, we said that the matan damim, he's got to do all four of them. All four must be done. And therefore, because all four matanos must be applied to the mizbeach, so the Zrikas Adam, or the Matanos Adam, is only complete once all four have been done. So the question is, what happens? Right, so the Mishnah had said that if he does the first three Matanos bishtika with no particular, right, without the machshav of chutzas manu, but the fourth Matana he does with machshav of chutzas manu, we said that it would not be pigul, since he didn't do all four matanos with machshavas chutzas manu, right? Because since he has to do all four, so all four cumulatively are the matanos adam, and all four must be done. And therefore, for pigul, you have to have, let's say you have to have machshava. Well, for sure, if you have machshava for all four of the matanos, it would be pigul. The question is, so the Mishnah had said that if for the first three, you had just a regular, right, b'shtika, you had a regular machshava, a kosher machshava, right, it says kisiknan properly, and then the fourth one is shelo kisiknan. So we said that would be possible, it would not be pigul. So now we're going to get into that discussion of kilu, when you have this scenario where you have these several matanos adam. We're going to get into kind of tomorrow really more, we're going to get into more complicated scenarios, but anyways, so when you have these four matanos, and all of them must be done, what happens if some of them were done with machshavas chutzas manu, some weren't? How does that exactly work out? So now, Tanan Awesome, we learn in Menachos, in a Mishnah, pigul bekometz velo balavona. So when it comes to a korban mincha, let's say a person donates, he says, I'm going to bring a korban mincha. Givaldik. So as part, so of course it's going to be a flour offering, and he's going to take a fistful of that flour mixed, right, also together with oil, but he takes a fistful of the flour offering, and he's going to burn that on the mizbeach. But he's also going to burn on the mizbeach livona, frankincense. So because there's two things that are being burnt on the mizbeach, the mincha as well as, right, the soles as well, the mincha, let's say, as well as the livona. So says the Mishnah, pigul bekometz, if when burning the fistful of the mincha, of the flour and oil, he had in mind to eat the shirai mincha, to eat the leftovers, right? Because by minchas nedava, so the kometz is burnt, the fistful is burnt, but the rest of the mincha is eaten by the kohanim. So if when burning the fistful, the kohen had machshava to eat the shiari mincha chutz lizmanu, v'lo b'levona, but by the burning of the frankincense, he didn't have such machshavos. He didn't have machshavas chutz zmanu. Or fakir, balavonav lo b'kometz, when burning the frankincense, he had a machshava of chutz zmanu, but not by the kometz. Reb Meir Omer pigul, v'chayav an olav kares. So Reb Meir says this is nonetheless pigul, even though he only had machshavas chutz zmanu by one of the two avodas, by either the kometz or by the livona. Still, says Reb Meir, that would be considered pigul. Whereas the Chacham disagree, and they say no. In order for it to be pigul, it would have to be mefaga b'chol amater. You would have to have kavana of chutz lizmano, both a machshava of chutz lizmano, both by the kometz as well as by the livona, both by the kometz as well as by the livona. So it would sound like, okay, so the Chacham say you have to have machshavas chutz zmano on the whole thing, both by the kometz and by the levona. Reb Meir is saying that if you had machshavas chutz zmano by the, let's say, the kometz, but not by the levona, it would still be pigul. So it's possibly, it sounds like Reb Meir is saying mefaglim b'chatzi matir, that it could be pigul even if we're only talking about part of the matir, right? Because what's the matir? It's what, right, in the case of the levona, in the case of the mincha, once the kometz and the livona are burned, so then that allows the shirayim to be eaten by the kohanim. Right? When it comes to a korban behema, so that would be the zrikas adam. Right? So after the zrikas adam, the meat can be eaten by the kohanim, the emurim can be burnt on the mizbech. When it comes to a mincha, so there are two matirin. There's the kometz as well as the livona. So it sounds like possibly what Meir is saying is that if there's a machshava of chutz zmano, even by one of the matirin, that would be enough to be pigul. So maybe he's saying that mifaglim b'chatzi matir, that you can have pigul with half of the matir. Amr Shimon ben Lakish says Rish Lakish, lo tematamidu Meir de kasov mifaglim b'chatzi matir. Oh, givaldik. So it says Rish Lakish, the reason for a Meir is not because he holds mefaglin b'chatzi hamatir. It was tempting to think that way, right? Because Meir says if he had chutz lizmano by the kometz but not by the livona, it's still pigul. However, Amr Reb Shimon ben Lakish says, Rish Lakish, lo tema tamid Reb Meir dikasavim mefaglin b'chatzi matir. Don't say that pshat with Reb Meir is that he holds mefaglin b'chatzi matir. Elo achav ma'eskinon kigon shenosan es akomes b'machshava v'alvona b'shtika. Wow. So it says Rish Lakish, it's specifically talking about where the kometz was with machshavas chutz lizmano v'alevona b'shtika, and the levona was not with machshavas chutz lizmano. It wasn't with any particular machshava of anything else either. It was just b'shtika. He didn't have any particular machshava. V'kasover kol ha'ose adas rishonu ose. And that says Rish Lakish, the Reb Meir shita is that kol ha'ose adas rishonu ose, that anybody who's doing stuff, the initial machshava sets the tone and determines the future. Meaning, since when he burnt the kometz, it was with machshavas chutz lizmano. So therefore, when he burns the levona without bishtika, without any particular machshava, the assumption is it's the initial machshava of chutz lizmano. Again, that kasover kol osa adas rishono osa, that anybody who's doing something, he's doing it based on the initial intention, and therefore, since the initial intention was chutz lizmanos by the kometz, so also by the levona, it's chutz lizmano, and therefore be'etzem, in a certain sense, Reb Meir actually is in agreement with the Chachamim that ein mefagim b'chatzi matir, that the entire, in this case by the mincha, the entire aktara of the levona and the kometz has to be with machshavas pigul. Where Reb Meir, the Chacham disagree is that Reb Meir say that the Chacham say that he would have to explicitly have machshavas chutz lizmano by both the kometz and the levona, whereas Reb Meir says that simply if he has machshavas chutz lizmanu by the kometz, then we can apply that same machshava to the levona, even if he didn't have any specific deliberate intention. However, if the kometz was bishtika and the levona was with machshavas chutz lizmanu, it would not be pigul, it would be puzzle instead. Mimai, how do we know that this is the shita of Reb Meir? I'll prove it to you. Midikatani, because if we just look at our Mishnah, what's going on in our Mishnah? Our Mishnah is talking about where the first three avodas were kisikna, it says. The first three matandam and matanos were kisikna, and only the fourth was shelo kisikna. The assumption is that the first were bishtika, the first three were bishtika, and the fourth was with machshavas chutz lizmanu. And we're saying that it's possible. If the first three matanos were kisiknon, let's assume that it means bishtika, and the fourth was with machshavas chutz lizmanu, possible. The ain bo karis, and there's no karis. But let's say that that's only because the last one was chutz lizmanu. But what the Mishnah doesn't say, but what we want to imply from the Mishnah is that if it was reversed, if the first matana was chutz lizmanu, then even if the rest of the three were bishtika, it would still be pigul, because the right kola osa das rishona osa, that the first matana of chutz lizmanu set the scene for the rest of them, i.e., and establish that all of them are going to be considered chutz lizmanu. V'chulim kisiknon pigul, it would be pigul money. Now, whose opinion would this be? Whose opinion would it be that if the last one was with machshavas chutz lizmanu, it would be puzzle, and if the first one was with machshavas chutz lizmanu, it would be pigul? It can't be the opinion of the Rabbanan. The Rabbanan say, no way, no how. You would have to have machshavas chutz lizmanu by all four of the matanos. Rather, if it's not the Rabbanan, who is it? Elo Reb Meir. We're saying that so therefore must be Reb Meir. And what do we see therefore? That what's the opinion of Reb Meir? That if the machshavas chutz lizmanu is at the end, well then it won't be pigul. If it's at the beginning, then it's pigul. And if you want to say that Reb Meir's opinion simply is that mifaglim b'chatzi matir, that even partial machshavas chutz lizmanu is pigul, well then afilu kediktani nami. Well then, if that's the case, then even in our Mishnah, Reb Meir should say pigul. If Reb Meir simply says mifaglim b'chatzi matir, that partial pigul is pigul, well then who cares if the machshava is at the beginning, the first of the matanos, or at the end? If it's partial machshava is pigul, it's pigul. But we see that there is a distinction between the beginning and the end. So therefore it must be that Reb Meir's shita is not simply mifaglim b'chatzi matir, but rather kind of like the Chachamim say that ein mifaglim, right? Ein mifaglim b'chatzi matir. Kilu, you have to, the entire thing would have to be pigul. But what he says is that if the first matana was done with machshavas chutz lizmanu, you can now assume that all the matanos, even if the rest of them were bishtika, nonetheless we'll assume that all of them were with machshavas chutz lizmanu, and therefore all of them would be pigul. So therefore you see what? That the Mishnah is Reb Meir's sheet is Reb Meir, and that Reb Meir makes a distinction between when the machshavas chutz lizmanu is at the end versus when it is at the beginning. When it's at the beginning, we'll say it's pigul because kol osa al das rishono ose, whereas when it's at the end, it's mifaglim b'chatzi matir, and it would not be pigul because ein mifaglim b'chatzi matir. Amr Shmuel bar Yitzchak says Shmuel bar Yitzchak le'olam rabbanani. So Shmuel bar Yitzchak wants to say that actually the Mishnah is the opinion of the rabbis, not the opinion of Reb Meir. Umay kisiknon lefigul. Very, very interesting. So Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak says that really the Mishnah is the Rabbanon who say that ein mefagim b'chatzi matir, that you knew what was the lashon? Achi yifaga b'chol amatir, right? That in order for it to be pigul, you're gonna have to have machshavas chutz lizmanu for all of the matanos. And what does it mean? Right, lefichach shalosh shelo, right, im nasan kulon kisiknon v'achas shelo kisiknon. What's kisiknon? Very interesting. Kisiknon means machshavas pigul. Kisiknon lefigul, i.e., what the Chachamim are saying. And it says of Shmuel bar Yitzchak that this is the opinion of the rabbis, and what they're saying is that all 4 matanos would have to be with machshavas chutz lizmanu, and if only the first 3 were kisiknon, which we're saying kisiknon lefigul, i.e., machshavas chutz lizmanu, but the 4th was not. Let's assume for now that it was bishtika, that it wasn't explicitly with the intention of chutz lizmanu. So it would not be pigul, right? And they're making the point, ein mefagim b'chatzi matir, that in order for it to be pigul, all of the matanos would have to be with machshavas chutz lizmanu. But here, only the first 3 were with machshavas chutz lizmanu. The 4th was not, therefore, pasul rather than pigul, right? Umay kisiknon the figul. They're saying that when it says that the first 3 were kisiknon, it means with the intention of pigul. Pasul vein bo kares michlad the sikna leachsher udasa. Have you heard the kasha? The kasha is that one second. Based on what Rav Shmuel bar Yitzchak just said, so the first 3 were machshavas chutz lizmanu, and Rashi points out. I'm just going to read one line of Rashi. In case you were wondering, which I'm sure many of you are, that when we're talking about machshavah, we're talking about idavka, he says it. He's motzi b'peh, he says it. And therefore, if by the first 3 matanos he said that he's having the intention of chutz lizmanu, and the 4th he was quiet, so if we're saying that the 4th he was simply quiet, then lo kisikna doesn't sound like he was just quiet. It means he did something wrong. Right? Shalosh, right? The fichach, right? If the first 3 were kisiknon, v'achas shelok. It doesn't say achas b'shtika. It says achas shelok kisikna. He did it wrong. That implies that the 4th one was wrong, and the first 3 were actually kosher. Again, from the fact that it says, and therefore, if nasan kulin kisiknon, if all of them were done properly, v'achas shelok kisiknon, pasul vein bo kares. Mechlad the siknon leachsheru. It sounds like shelo kisiknon, they did something wrong, whereas kisiknon means it was actually kosher. Huda. So Amar Rave says Rave, my shelo kisiknon chutz limkoma. So says Rave, no. When it says shalosh kisikna v'achas shelo kisikna, so the shalosh kisikna are kisikna lefigul. Okay, so the Mishnah is the rabbis, and it's saying that the first 3 were done with machshavas chutz lizmanu. However, the 4th was shelo kisikna, meaning machshavas chutz limkoma. The 4th was machshavas chutz limkoma. Rav Ashi Amar shelo lishmo. Rav Ashi says alternatively that the 4th matana was shelo lishmo, right? Because we're talking about a korban chatas, a chatas apnimis, and by a chatas, of course, as we know from the first Mishnah of the Masechta, shelo lishmo is pasul. So if the first 3 were done with machshavas pigul, right, chutz lizmanu, but the 4th matana was either chutz limkomo, with machshavas chutz limkomo, or shelo lishma, so then it will be pasul. Michla, but does that imply the chilo avidla chutz limkomo v'shelo lishma michayev? But does that therefore imply then? Okay, so if the first 3 were done with machshavas shelo chutz lizmanu, and the 4th was either chutz limkomo or shelo lishma, it's pasul. What if the first 3 matanos were chutz lizmanu, and the 4th one there was no machshava of shelo lishma or chutz limkomo? He was just quiet. Does that imply that it would be pigul? Right? Meaning, if we're saying that the Mishnah is saying that the first 3 were kisikna, and we're saying kisikna lepigul, i.e. with machshavas chutz lizmanu, and the 4th was shelo kisikna, i.e. chutz limkomo or shelo lishma. What if the 4th was just quiet? Not machshavas chutz limkomo or shelo lishma, just quiet. Does that imply that that would be pigul? But the Chacham said that you would have to have explicitly all four of them would have to be, right? All four matanos would have to explicitly be machshavas chutz lizmano. So rather, says the Gemara, no. Also, if the fourth matana was bishtika, was just quiet, that would also be pasul. However, there was a symmetry thing going on over here. I did the Tana Reisha, pigul v'chayav and all of kares. Tana nami seifa pasul ve'embo kares. However, if you remember the Reisha of the Mishnah, when it was talking about chutz, when it was talking about chatos achitzonos, what did it say? By chatos achitzonos, it said, well, since only one of the matanos is ma'akev, since you only have to do one of the matanos, and even if you didn't do the subsequent ones, the korban would still be kosher. Therefore, said the Mishnah, if the first matana was done with machshavas chutz lizmano, even if the subsequent ones were with machshavas chutz limkomo, it would be pigul, since only the first one is the one that's really required. And if that one was done with machshavas chutz lizmano, it would be pigul, even if the subsequent ones were chutz limkomo. And what we're saying in the Seifa is the opposite is true by chatos pnimios, that because by chatos pnimios, all four matanos are ma'akev, so therefore if you would have a scenario where we're saying that the first three were done, right, even the first three were done with machshavas chutz lizmano, but the fourth was chutz limkomo, by chatos pnimios, it would be pasul, it would not be pigul. But the truth is, right, even if it was bishtika, it would also be pigul. But the point is that we wanted to be symmetrical with the ratio, whereas in the ratio, when the first was chutz lizmano and the rest were chutz limkomo, it would be pigul. In the Seifa, since all four matanos are ma'akev, if the first three even are chutz lizmano, but the fourth is chutz limkomo, it would be pasul rather than pigul. Even though, yeah, if you were just bishtika, it would also be pigul. But it wanted to kind of keep the symmetry between the Reisha and the Seifa. That was Daf Mem Aleph of Masechta Zevachim. On the first section of Daf Mem Aleph, we learned about the Siri avodah zarah halachos, i.e., right, we had been having all sorts of krises and crossings and weaving between par kohen Mashiach, par davar shel tzibur, Siri avodah zarah, par Yom HaKippurim, Seiri Yom HaKippurim. So today we drilled down into Siri Avodah Zarah and talked about specifically the requirement to burn the Yoseres HaKaved and the Shtei HaKlayos and how that's learned out from Par Davar Shel Tzibur, which really comes from Par Kohen Mashiach. We then moved on to Mifaglim b'chatzi amatir, which is very interesting. We saw a Mishnah from Masechta Menachos, a machlokas between Rav Meir and the Chachamim, that when it comes to a mincha, where you have to offer both the komets as well as the levona, what happens if you had machshavas chutz lizmano by the komets but not by the levona? The Chachamim say, pasul, it's not pigul, because you would have to have pigul for the entire matir by both machshavas chutz lizmano by both the komets as well as the levona in order for it to be pigul. Whereas Rav Meir says it is pigul, and the shaila is, why does Rav Meir say it's pigul? Is it because he holds mefaglim b'chatzi amatir, that even chutz lizmano, an intention of chutz lizmano on part of the matir, which in this case is the komets and the levona, could be pigul? So says Rish Lakish, no. The reason for Rav Meir is actually because he holds that kol ha'osa al das rishona hu osa, that when somebody does something, he does it based on the initial intention, and the initial intention sets the sort of, I don't think the right word is tone, but kind of sets the trajectory for what's going to happen next. And therefore, what Rav Meir is saying is that if by the komets he had machshavas chutz lizmano, and by the levona he was just bishtika, we assume that it's that same machshavas chutz lizmano by the levona as well, and therefore the entire thing, according to Rav Meir, is actually being done with machshavas chutz lizmano, based on the fact that the komets, the initial step, was done with machshavas chutz lizmano. Friends, that was Daf Mem Aleph of Masechta Zevachim. I hope you enjoyed. Cheers.